In the closing decades of the 13th century, in a place called Sogot, in the rough hill country of northwestern Anatolia, a small group of nomadic Turkish horsemen pitched their tents along a stream. They were perhaps 500 fighting men. They were the Kai clan, members of the broader Oghuz Turkish people who had been migrating westward across the steppe for 2 centuries. They had been pushed into Anatolia by the Mongol invasions that had swept across Central Asia in the previous generation. They were small. They were unimportant. Their leader was a man named Ertugrul, who held a tiny strip of land granted by the Seljuk Sultan in exchange for service as a frontier warrior. Ertugrul died around 1280. His son took over the leadership of the clan. His son's name was Osman. From this insignificant start, the family of Osman would build the largest and most enduring Islamic empire of the past 1,000 years. The Ottoman Empire. The Osmanli dynasty. The seat, eventually, of the Caliphate of all Muslims. They would rule from the Atlantic coast of Morocco to the Persian Gulf. They would conquer Constantinople, Cairo, Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem, Damascus, Baghdad, Vienna's outskirts, and the gates of Central Europe. They would last for 625 years. This is part 1 of a 7-part series tracing the entire history of the Ottoman Caliphate. In this first part we follow the founders: Osman Gazi, Orhan Gazi, Murad I. 3 generations who turned a tribal warrior band into one of the great powers of the medieval world. By the end of this episode we will be standing on the field of Kosovo, on June 15, 1389, watching the death of Sultan Murad. 3 lifetimes. 300 kilometers of conquest. The end of a Christian empire and the beginning of the longest-lived Islamic caliphate in history. To understand how the Ottomans rose, you have to understand the world they rose into. In the year 1250, Anatolia, the great peninsula that today forms most of Turkey, was a battlefield of empires. The Byzantine Empire, the surviving eastern half of the Roman world, still ruled the western coast and a few interior cities. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, a Turkish Islamic state, ruled the central plateau from its capital at Konya. Various Crusader states held coastal enclaves along the Mediterranean. Greek, Armenian, and Georgian Christian populations lived in the mountains. Then, in 1243, came the Mongols. The Mongol army of Hulagu Khan smashed the Seljuk forces at the Battle of Kozdag. The Seljuk Sultanate became a Mongol client state. By the late 1200s, Mongol authority had collapsed in turn. Anatolia descended into political chaos. The plateau fragmented into dozens of small Turkish principalities called beyliks, each ruled by a former Seljuk officer or tribal leader. The Byzantine Empire, weakened by the catastrophic Fourth Crusade of 1204, was a shadow of its former self. The frontier between the surviving Byzantine territories and the patchwork of Turkish beyliks ran through northwestern Anatolia. It was an open zone, a place where ambitious warriors could carve out estates, where religious motivation and military opportunity blended together. The Turkish word for these frontier holy warriors was Ghazi. They were not exactly mercenaries. They were not exactly missionaries. They were both, plus settlers, plus opportunists. The Kai clan of Osman lived squarely in this Ghazi zone. Their territory was a small strip of land at Sogot, sandwiched between the larger Turkish beyliks of Jermian and Karasi to the south and west, and the surviving Byzantine border fortresses to the north and east. Sogot means willow tree. It was a quiet place. The Kai grazed their sheep in summer pastures in the high country. They wintered in the lower valleys. They occasionally raided across the frontier into Byzantine territory. Osman became their leader around 1280. He was perhaps in his early 20s. The dates are uncertain. Most of what we know about Osman comes from later Ottoman histories written a century or 2 after his lifetime. The reliable record is thin. The legendary record is rich. According to the legendary tradition, Osman had a vision shortly after taking leadership. He dreamed that a great tree grew from his loins, its branches stretching across continents, its leaves shading the world. He took the dream as a divine sign. He was destined to found an empire. The dream is almost certainly a later invention. The actual rise was less mystical and more practical. Osman built his power through opportunism. The Byzantine Empire was distracted by civil wars and Catholic crusader threats from the west. The neighboring Turkish beyliks were occupied with their own internal conflicts. Osman attacked the small Byzantine fortresses scattered along his frontier. He raided the Christian villages in the Bilchik Valley. He gradually expanded his territory through a combination of pressure, opportunity, and strategic alliance. He married the daughter of a local sheikh, gaining religious legitimacy. He recruited Ghazi warriors from across Anatolia, drawn by the success of his raids. By 1301, his forces were strong enough to defeat a small Byzantine army at the Battle of Baphias, near the Sea of Marmara. The Baphias victory was Osman's breakthrough. After the battle, his name spread across Anatolia. Turkish warriors began arriving from distant beyliks to join his service. The Kai clan was no longer a small frontier band. It was the rising Turkish power on the Byzantine border. For the next 20 years, Osman expanded methodically. He took the small towns of Yenisehir and Inegol. He invested the strategic city of Bursa, the most important Byzantine center in northwestern Anatolia, blockading it for over 2 decades. He never personally captured Bursa. He did not live to see it fall. By the time of his death, around 1324, his small frontier emirate had become a regional power controlling several thousand square kilometers and tens of thousands of subjects. Osman is buried in Bursa, in a small tomb that became a shrine for later sultans. His sword, called the Sword of Osman, became the central object of the Ottoman coronation ceremony. Every successive Ottoman sultan would be girded with the Sword of Osman in a ritual modeled on the European tradition of investiture. The dynasty he founded would carry his name for 600 years. Osmanli, the people of Osman. We anglicize it as Ottoman. He was succeeded by his son Orhan, who completed what his father had begun. Orhan was probably born around 1281. He grew up watching his father's emirate expand. By the time he succeeded Osman in 1324, he was an experienced commander. His first major achievement was the long-anticipated capture of Bursa in 1326. The city had been blockaded for over 2 decades. It surrendered to Orhan with terms guaranteeing the lives and property of its Christian inhabitants, a precedent the Ottomans would follow throughout their early conquests. The strategy was deliberate. Mass killings would have driven Christian populations away. Tolerated coexistence allowed the Ottoman state to absorb Byzantine cities, Byzantine economies, and Byzantine populations into its growing administration. Orhan made Bursa his capital. He built mosques, religious schools called madrasas, and the famous covered market called the Kapali Kasi. The city became the political and religious center of the early Ottoman state. Orhan also began the institutional transformation that would define the empire. The original Ottoman force had been a tribal cavalry of Ghazis, men who fought for plunder, religious motivation, and the favor of their leader. Orhan began converting this informal warrior band into a permanent state apparatus. He created the first standing infantry, called the Yaya, paid by the state and equipped with state-issued weapons. He established a system of land grants, called Timur, in which Turkish cavalry warriors were given the right to collect taxes from specific villages in exchange for military service when called upon. Most importantly, he began the recruitment system that would eventually produce the famous Janissary Corps. The system was called the Devshirme, the Levi. The state collected boys, typically aged 7 to 15, from Christian families in the conquered territories of Rumelia. The boys were converted to Islam, given intensive military and administrative training, and absorbed into a permanent professional service. Some were trained as elite infantry, the Janissaries. Some became palace administrators. Some rose to become provincial governors and grand viziers. The system was controversial then and remains controversial in historical memory. It removed boys from their families and converted them to Islam. It also created a professional class loyal directly to the Sultan, with no kinship or tribal loyalties to compete with state service. The result was an unusually meritocratic and effective administrative apparatus, drawn entirely from Christian-born converts who owed their advancement to the Sultan personally. Orhan also expanded the empire's territory. He absorbed the small Turkish Beylik of Karasi to his west, gaining access to the Aegean coast. He defeated successive Byzantine armies sent from Constantinople. He took the cities of Iznik in 1331 and Izmit in 1337. By the late 1340s, the Ottoman state controlled almost all of northwestern Anatolia. The Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, John VI Cantacuzene, was reduced to seeking Ottoman assistance against rival claimants for his own throne. He gave his daughter Theodora in marriage to Orhan in 1346, a humiliating diplomatic concession that signaled the changing power balance. Then came the moment that transformed the Ottoman state from a regional Anatolian power into a transcontinental empire. The crossing of the Dardanelles. In 1352, during the Byzantine Civil War, Orhan's son Suleiman led a small Ottoman force across the Dardanelles Strait to assist John VI. They occupied the small fortress of Tsimp on the European side. After the civil war ended, the Ottomans refused to leave. In 1354, after a devastating earthquake had damaged the Byzantine fortifications at the city of Gallipoli, Suleiman seized the city. The Ottomans now had a permanent foothold in Europe. From Gallipoli, Ottoman forces could expand into Thrace, the rich agricultural plain north of the Sea of Marmara. They could threaten Constantinople from both sides simultaneously. They could begin the conquest of the Balkans. The crossing into Europe was the most consequential event of Orhan's reign. By the time he died in 1362, the Ottomans were no longer just a Turkish frontier state. They were a Eurasian power with territories on both sides of the Bosphorus, with a growing administration, and with an army organized for sustained campaigning rather than seasonal raiding. Orhan was succeeded by his son Murad I. Murad was probably born around 1326. He had spent his youth as a provincial governor, learning the practical business of administration. He came to the throne at about 36, a mature and experienced commander. His reign would last for 27 years, the longest of the early Ottoman period. Under his leadership, the Ottoman state would transform from a frontier expansion into a structured empire. He would make Edirne his European capital. He would consolidate Ottoman administrative institutions. He would conduct the campaigns that brought most of the Balkans under Ottoman rule. And he would die at the head of his army on the field of Kosovo in 1389. Murad's first major task was suppressing internal challenges. Several Turkish vassals in Anatolia attempted to revolt while he was establishing his rule. He defeated them quickly. He also dealt with a crisis in his own court. His brothers Ibrahim and Halil, who had been potential rivals to the throne, were killed during this period. The fratricide of Ottoman succession had begun. It would become a brutal but stable mechanism for transferring power, eventually formalized by Mehmed II a century later. With his rear secured, Murad turned to Europe. The Ottoman foothold at Gallipoli was now expanded to a serious campaign of conquest in Thrace. Ottoman forces moved north through the rich agricultural lowlands. The Byzantine and Bulgarian fortresses fell one by one. The most important conquest was Edirne, the city the Greeks called Adrianople, in 1369. Edirne sat on the major road from Constantinople to the Balkans. It controlled access to the entire region. Murad made it the new Ottoman capital. The state now had two capitals, one in Bursa for its Asian provinces and one in Edirne for its European provinces. The Edirne Palace and the surrounding mosques became the political center of the empire for the next century. Murad's strategy in the Balkans was patient and effective. He combined direct military conquest with the absorption of weaker Christian states as Ottoman vassals. He conquered Plovdiv in 1364. He defeated a Hungarian-Serbian-Bosnian-Wallachian coalition at the Battle of the Maritsa River in 1371, a decisive victory that established Ottoman dominance over the southern Balkans. 2 Serbian princes were killed in the battle. The remaining Serbian